There is a kind of grief no one teaches you to name. It doesn't arrive with a funeral. There is no casket, no ceremony, no moment where the world pauses to acknowledge what you've lost. It arrives quietly on a Tuesday afternoon, maybe when you're sitting across from someone you've known for years, someone you've shared laughter with, someone who once felt like home, and you realize with a strange and terrible clarity that you no longer recognize the space between you, not because they changed, but because you did, and somehow, impossibly, that feels like your fault. This is the guilt of outgrowing others. And if you're watching this, there's a good chance you know exactly what that silence feels like. Most people assume that growth is a purely joyful thing. Society sells it to you that way: the glow up, the level up, the transformation arc, before and after pictures of people who finally found themselves. But no one shows you the part that happens just before the after photo. No one shows you the 2 a.m. moments where you're lying in the dark, wondering why becoming more feels so much like losing everything. No one warns you that the closer you get to your most honest self, the further some people begin to feel, not because you pushed them away, but simply because you kept walking when they chose to. Stay still. Growth at its truest is not a celebration. It is, first and foremost, a separation. Think about a tree. When it begins to grow, really grow, its roots go deeper into the soil, pushing through rock and resistance, searching for something more sustaining than the surface. But as those roots push down, the branches push up, away from the shade of whatever once sheltered them. The tree doesn't resent the shade. It doesn't forget the rain that helped it survive its earliest years. But it has to grow beyond the canopy, not out of arrogance, out of biological necessity, out of nature. You are no different. The problem is that trees don't feel guilty. You do. Let's talk about why that guilt exists, because it isn't random. It isn't a character flaw. It isn't proof that you're cold or disloyal or secretly arrogant. It is, in fact, one of the most deeply human responses you could possibly have. And to understand it, we have to go back further than the relationships you've outgrown. We have to go back to something far older, something written into you long before you were ever conscious of it. Psychologists call it the belonging imperative. For the vast majority of human history, survival was not an individual pursuit. It was a collective one. Early humans who were cast out from their group didn't just experience emotional pain, they experienced mortal danger. Isolation wasn't loneliness. Isolation was death. And so the human nervous system evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to treat social rejection as a physical threat. The same neurological pathways that light up when you break a bone activate when you feel excluded. Rejection doesn't just hurt your feelings. In the deepest biological sense, it hurts. Now carry that understanding forward into what happens when you begin to grow. When growth creates distance from the people around you, your nervous system doesn't interpret that as evolution. It interprets it as exile. Your body doesn't know the difference between being cast out and choosing to move forward. It only knows the group is no longer behind you, and that triggers a very ancient alarm, one that whispers, go back. Shrink, make yourself fit. The cost of being different is too high. That whisper, that is where guilt is born. But there's a second layer to this guilt, and it's more personal, more intricate, and far more painful. And it has to do with something psychologists call ambiguous loss. Dr. Pauline Boss, who coined the term, described ambiguous loss as grief without closure. It's the mourning of something that hasn't technically ended, but has quietly, irreversibly changed. You experience this with relationships that don't have a clean breaking point. No betrayal, no explosive argument, no single moment you can point to and say, that's when everything fell apart. Instead, There are just small moments accumulating over time. A conversation that falls flat, a dream you stopped sharing because the response felt hollow. A version of yourself you used to perform for them, smaller, quieter, less that you no longer remember how to wear. This is the invisible grief, and invisible grief is the hardest to process because the people around you can't validate what they can't see. You can't explain to someone, "I'm mourning a friendship that technically still exists." You can't justify the sadness when there was no incident, no wound, no obvious cause. So, the grief turns inward, and inward grief, unacknowledged and unnamed, transforms slowly into guilt. Because if nothing bad happened, if no one did anything wrong, if the relationship still technically exists, then the distance must be your fault. You must be the one who changed too much. You must be the one who got arrogant, who got too big for your old life. You must be the one who failed at loyalty. This is the lie guilt tells you, and it is remarkably convincing. Here's something worth sitting with. When you begin to grow, truly grow, not just in career or status, but in self-awareness, in emotional intelligence, in the depth of questions you're willing to ask yourself, you don't just gain new perspectives, you gain new vision, and new vision is not always comfortable because suddenly you begin to see things you couldn't see before. Emotional patterns in relationships that once felt normal, loops of conversation that never go anywhere, shared complaints that function as bonding rituals rather than genuine connection, comfort that, upon closer inspection, was built less on mutual growth and more on mutual stagnation. This is what psychologists sometimes refer to as metacognitive expansion, the moment when your mind develops the capacity to observe itself and its environment from a wider perspective. And in that widening, something uncomfortable happens. You realize that some of the connections you've held most tightly were never built to sustain the person you are becoming. Not because those people are bad, not because the relationships were fake, but because they were built for a specific version of you, a version defined by particular fears, particular wounds, particular needs. And that version has evolved. Think of it like this. Imagine you spent years living in a small apartment. It fit you perfectly at the time. It was warm, familiar, safe. You knew every corner, every creak in the floorboards, every way the light fell on a winter afternoon. And then, over time, you began to accumulate more books, more ideas, more life. And one day, you realize the walls are pressing in. Not because the apartment got smaller, but because you got larger. And the guilt of leaving isn't about the apartment being wrong. It's about the grief of knowing it once felt like enough. Now here is where it gets even more complicated. Because the guilt of outgrowing others doesn't just come from within. It comes from something far more insidious. It comes from the subtle, often unspoken social tax that is levied on those who change. When you begin to evolve, when you start making different choices, asking uncomfortable questions, refusing familiar patterns, the people around you don't always respond with celebration. Sometimes they respond with silence, with slight withdrawal, with comments that feel light on the surface, but carry weight underneath. "You've changed," said not as a compliment, but as an accusation. "You think you're better than us now," said not to understand, but to wound. "You used to be so much more fun," said not with nostalgia, but with warning, "Come back, fit back in." Stop making us uncomfortable with your transformation. This is what sociologists call tall poppy syndrome, the social tendency to cut down those who rise above a shared baseline. And it is staggeringly common, because when one person in a close group begins to change significantly, it creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance in the others. Your growth, by its very existence, becomes a mirror, and some people are not yet ready to look at what that mirror shows them. So they don't punish your growth directly. Instead, they create subtle pressure, small moments of exclusion. Inside references you're no longer part of, an energy that says, without words, the old you was easier to love. And you, being empathetic, because people who feel this guilt are almost always deeply empathetic, you absorb that pressure. You internalize it. You start to believe that your growth is not just inconvenient to others, but genuinely harmful. That by becoming more yourself, you are somehow taking something away from them. You begin to shrink, not all at once, gradually, the way a candle flickers before it goes out. But let's pause here for just a moment, because there's something happening underneath all of this guilt that almost no one talks about. Beneath the grief of fading friendships, beneath the social pressure, beneath the biological fear of exile, there is a much quieter and much more personal terror. The fear that if you keep going, if you keep growing, if you keep becoming, you might eventually arrive somewhere no one else has followed. And you'll be standing there, more yourself than you've ever been, and you'll be completely, devastatingly alone. That fear is the engine behind all of it, and it's the thing we need to understand most carefully. Because that fear, the fear of arriving alone, is not a sign that growth is wrong. It is a sign that you have loved deeply, that you have valued connection, that you are not someone who discards people carelessly. And that tenderness, that very tenderness that makes the guilt so heavy, is also your greatest proof that you never outgrew your humanity. Only your limitations. Here is the reframe that changes everything. You did not leave people behind. You left behind a version of yourself that could no longer breathe, and those are two entirely different things. One is abandonment, the other is survival. The relationships that faded were not failures, they were chapters. And a chapter ending does not invalidate the story it told. You are allowed to carry gratitude for what someone meant to you at a particular season of your life, without owing them every season that follows. Love does not always mean permanence. Sometimes it means appreciation. Sometimes it means wishing someone well from a distance your growth has created. And as for the loneliness, that strange floating feeling of being between who you were and who you're becoming, understand this: it is temporary, but it is also necessary, because the space that opens up when old connections loosen is not empty. It is available for people who will meet you where you actually are, not where you used to be, not where you were comfortable, where you are now honest and unfiltered and fully present. Those people exist. They are also out there, carrying the same quiet guilt, floating in the same in-between, wondering if their growth made them too much or not enough. And when your paths cross, you will recognize each other not by history but by direction. So let the guilt soften. Not disappear, soften. Let it remind you that you are someone who cares. Then let it go. You did not betray anyone by becoming yourself. You simply kept a promise you made to your own soul long before anyone else entered the story. And that is not something to apologize for. That is something to protect. If this touched something in you, something you've never quite had the words for, you are not alone. Someone else is watching this right now, feeling exactly what you feel. And if this channel helps you understand yourself a little more deeply, consider subscribing. Not for the numbers, but so the next time life gets quiet and heavy, you know exactly where to come.